Okay, this meeting, the following meeting is being conducted by electronic means in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law 1975, amended 2020, which explicitly permits a public body to conduct meetings electronically during the state of emergency. Adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the Coaster and Asbury Park Press. All notices are on file with the board secretary. In addition, a notice regarding this virtual meeting and instructions were published in the Asbury Park Press and the City of Asbury Park website. A copy of this notice is on file with the board secretary. The notices and conduct of this meeting are in accordance with the guidelines of virtual meetings issued by the State of New Jersey Department of Community Affairs. Please note, all microphones of public users are muted until the public question and answer period. If you would like to speak during this time only, please use the raise hand button in Zoom if on a computer, or dial *9 if on a telephone. Your name or last 4 digits of your phone number will be called when it's your turn to speak. If at any time during your question you are deemed to be out of line or topic, we reserve the right to mute your microphone and will make an announcement that this has occurred. During the public's comment session only, the public will have 3 minutes to speak. Please turn off all cell phones and electronic devices during the meeting. Please identify yourself when you speak at all times. And this meeting is being recorded and will be available via APTV in the future. Please join me in the salute of the flag. Pledge allegiance
To the flag
To the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one
one nation, under God, indivisible,
and
with
justice.
liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I'm going to take roll now. Mayor John Moore,
Here.
Councilwoman Clayton,
Can you say that again, Irina?
Councilman
I think you called me. I'm here, but you're breaking up.
Okay.
on. Michael Manzella,
Here.
thank you. Jim Henry,
Here,
Jennifer Sutter,
Here.
Trudy Syfax, Alexis Taylor,
Here.
Eric Gallipo,
Here.
Rick Lambert,
Here.
and Barbara Kizak.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, first up on the agenda is the approval of minutes of the meeting of June 8th, 2020. That was the special meeting that occurred. Does anybody have any concerns about those minutes? If not, can I get a motion to approve those minutes?
Jim Henry, motion to approve.
Sorry, this is Jen Souter. I'm sorry, my mute didn't go unmute. I just sent one little note today of a quick change regarding one comment. That was, should I just say it on here?
Yes.
Just that a comment about the pathway behind the building. I just wanted to add without public access.
Where is that, Jennifer?
I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. It's a Souter comment. I'm not sure which page. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay.
Hang on one second, Jennifer. Let me try to get it on the screen.
Thank you. I sent it in an email with like a little highlight, but it's only to Irina.
I'll amend my motion to include Jennifer's comment.
Second, Mike Manzella.
Okay, thank you. Motion by Henry.
Aye.
Aye. Because I think that you said all in favor.
Aye.
I did. Any opposed? Okay. Minutes approved with the corrections that I will make with Jennifer Souter. Thank you.
All right, the next item on the agenda are amendments to the bylaws. There, the bylaw committee met and requested some changes to be made to the bylaws. Does anybody have any concerns about the changes that were provided?
Yes, Barbara, Jim Henry again. On page 2, item G.
Yes?
It says, right now it says, the time allotted for public comment shall be limited to 3 minutes. I would like to change that to the time allotted for public comments by each member of the public shall be limited to 3 minutes.
That's fair.
I will make a note of that. Thank you, Mr. Henry.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I will make a note of it. Thank you, Mr. Henry.
Okay.
Anybody else have any concerns or questions? Okay, can I get a motion to approve the changes to the bylaws?
This is Jen Souter. I'll make a motion to approve the bylaw changes.
Jim Henry, second.
I have a motion by Jennifer Souter and a second by Jim Henry. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Amendment approved.
All right, at this time, we have 2 applications that are up for discussion on the agenda today. At this point, I, Barbara Krizak, will recuse myself and turn over to Rick Lambert as acting chair for the duration of this meeting on this topic.
Hi, this is Rick Lambert. The application is the AP Triangle LLC subdivision and site plan approval. Before we get started, maybe we'd have Jack swear in the board professionals.
Sure. Donna, Jason, Doug, please raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear the testimony about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
And please state your respective names and your position with the board for the record, please. Thanks.
Donna Miller, board planner.
Jason Fitchter, board engineer.
Doug Cleland, board engineer.
Okay.
Thank you. Also, excuse me. Also, Jack, if you could just kind of reinforce what the public can do in cross-examination. We kind of fell into a rabbit hole last meeting, and I don't want that to happen again. So
Yeah.
I want the public to be clear on what they are allowed to do and what our role will be as the board and the board attorney to make sure this meeting moves at a nice pace and we keep on time and we don't just kind of flounder around like we did last meeting. I don't want that to happen again.
Okay. If you are on direct testimony, your testimony should be relevant to the application at hand, non-argumentative, and material to what's going on before the board with the application. On cross-examination, the scope of your cross-examination, whether it's by an attorney or a member of the public, should be limited to the basic scope of direct examination of the witness, whether it be a factual witness or a professional. giving an expert opinion, which you're allowed to question the expert opinion. But the questions have to be relevant, material, non-argumentative, non-redundant, and make sense. Basically, those are the rules. Bylaw that was just passed certainly codified that people will be given a warning thereafter. Either myself or the board chair can mute that individual for in terms of questioning that witness. And as far as public comments at the end of the meeting, they have to be deemed relevant to the application at hand. Straightforward. Just tell us what your opinion is, for or against, whichever way you feel about the application, and why, and what it has to do with what we heard. And it's really that simple.
Thank you. And I just want to remind the the public that the application, this site plan approval is not like a traditional site plan approval where we're reviewing the overall development plan. That's been approved already. We have just specific items that we are considering, which are waivers, variances, and the subdivision plan. So, your questions relevant to the testimony have to be within the scope of that understanding of what it is that the planning board is approving. So just want to make sure that everyone understands that, and we don't go off on these tangents about things that have already been decided by the TRC and the development authority that's not up for consideration. So that being said, I think we can move forward now. And Ms. Porter, I turn it over to you.
Great. So good evening, everyone. Jennifer Porter with CSG, attorney for the applicant, AP Triangle. We previously met with this board on 2 occasions, back on May 18th and on June 8th. At our initial appearance in May, we set forth all of our subdivision testimony by our site engineer as well as our planner. And then at the meeting in June, we presented our first 2 witnesses in connection with the site plan application. So we went through our architectural testimony as well as our site plan testimony. At the last meeting in June, a number of issues were raised by both the board and members of the public. And since that meeting, we've had some extensive discussions regarding ways in which we could address some of those items before the board this evening. And so as part of my opening, I wanted to touch upon 4 specific areas that will be addressed throughout the evening with regard to questions and issues that were raised by the board at the last meeting. The first issue deals with DEP and stormwater. With respect to stormwater, we had indicated at the last meeting that we were waiting on feedback from DEP regarding the project's conformance with the DEP CAFRA permit. We contacted DEP after the last meeting to ascertain whether or not the proposed stormwater design was in conformance with that CAFRA permit for the waterfront redevelopment area. On July 1st, DEP issued a written response letter, which we had pre-marked as Exhibit A15 for the board, which specifically indicated that based upon DEP's review of the stormwater report and the plans for this project, and those are the same plans and report that are currently before this board, that the project was in conformance with the CAFRA permit for the waterfront redevelopment area, and that no additional stormwater measures were required to be addressed at the site.
We're going to address that issue later on.
Correct, exactly. It's the applicant's intention this evening that we be permitted to proceed with our testimony by our landscape architect and our planner, since we haven't gotten to those witnesses yet. And then after that point in time, we will go back to revisit any additional issues that were raised by the board and can clarify further.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So a second issue is the AC units. There were a number of comments raised with respect particularly to the location of the AC compressor locations in the front yard of some of the units. And after careful consideration, the applicant has determined that the AC compressor locations can be accommodated on the roof. And so that is something that the applicant is willing to do with respect to the application. The third point relates to Cookman Avenue and the orientation of the buildings. So there were a number of comments raised by the board and the public with respect to the orientations of the building and with regard to the Cookman Avenue perspective and what essentially the as-built condition of the project would look like from Cookman Avenue. So our architect had provided lengthy testimony on this issue at the prior meeting, and the fact that the townhome buildings will not just be fronting directly on Cookman, showing the side view of the buildings, but rather they would be separated by a park parcel and extensive landscaping. And so to better have the board understand what that may potentially look like as an as-built condition, we have created 2 renderings. Those will be discussed as part of our planning testimony this evening. One of the renderings shows the as-built condition of the building. It shows the proposed landscaping that's consistent with our landscape plan, and then it shows the existing grass lawn area at the site currently. The other rendering shows all of those things that I just mentioned, but in addition to that, it shows an illustrative plan, which is one potential design of what the park could look like. And so that's something that I wanted to touch upon in terms of the legal aspects of that plan at the beginning. And as I indicated, we'll discuss that further as part of our planning testimony. So that plan that's showing the park is being submitted for illustrative purposes only. And what we mean by that is that it's intending to show what, as one example, the park could look like. It's obviously being designed to show the project in conformance and the park in conformance with what potentially could happen in that area of the site. As we had explained at the prior meetings and the prior hearings, the ultimate design of the park is subject to the review and approval of City Council in accordance with the subsequent developer agreement. So what's important to note for this board is that as a critical consideration with respect to what the as-built condition of the site will look like from Cookman, the park will be completed prior to the completion of phase 1 of the townhome construction, meaning that before the first string of townhomes obtain the COs for those townhomes, the park has to be designed. It has to be we have to show the landscaping plans to City Council. It has to be approved, and it has to be put into place and constructed. So it's very important for us in terms of this presentation that even though the park itself is not part of the site plan review that's before this board, to convey to the board that a park will exist and will separate the view of the townhome buildings from Cookman Avenue. And again, that will be addressed through our planning testimony as well. Another note that we wanted to make is that there was a comment with regard to some of the street improvements along Cookman. In particular, I think that there was a comment regarding street trees. And that's something important that we wanted to address as well. We show on the renderings what the street trees will look like once they are completed. However, the street trees are a master developer obligation under our public infrastructure. It's our infrastructure component report. And essentially that, in connection with the 2018 amendments to the master developer agreement, provide that there is an obligation on the master developer, so not the applicant under this application, but the master developer in the waterfront redevelopment area to complete street improvements, and in this case it would include the street trees, once the lot has been or reached 50% development. So that is the critical trigger. That will not be the case and will not be triggered as a result of this application. However, it is an obligation of the master developer. So once the remainder of the site is completed, those street improvements will go into place and those street trees will be present on the site. Now, the last issue I wanted to touch upon, which will be addressed through our landscape architect testimony this evening, is the pathway. There were a number of comments raised by the board regarding whether or not the applicant would be willing to make the pathway public. And again, the applicant went back and had, serious internal discussions, in particular as to this issue, because as we have discussed at the 2 prior meetings, there were a number of safety and security considerations. There's marketability issues. There are various factors which went into the ultimate decision of the applicant to keep the path private for the townhouse residents. However, in light of the fact that we received significant feedback from the board on this issue, and that it was noted in some of the prior discussions we had at TRC or otherwise in the planner's reports, we can agree and are willing to agree to make the path public as a condition of approval. However, in order to do that, some changes would need to be made to the site plan as it's currently shown with respect to the pathway. The path would need to be aligned directly with the easterly boundary of the property to the remainder lot. The fence, which is currently located on the easterly side of the path, would need to be shifted to the other side of the path. So again, there is a point of separation between the townhouse buildings and the residences, and we would have to create a secondary path that would allow access to the rear of the units from that pathway. And this will all be explained further through our landscaping testimony. I understand it's difficult to have a picture of this in your mind, so we'll explain this during our landscaping testimony. But I raise it now because there are some legal points, again, that relate specifically to the applicant's agreement to consider this as a public path. We would agree to granting a public easement for the path, but it would be subject to a reservation of rights to allow for utility connections, potentially stormwater connections, and other reservations which would be required in connection with ongoing development of the remainder of the triangle parcel. And the second and most important consideration is that in order for us to create this as a public path, the city must be willing to agree to accept all liability for the path, as well as maintenance responsibility for the path. And I had discussed this point a little bit with the board attorney, but wanted to raise it with the board this evening, that to the extent that the city is unwilling to agree to take on liability in connection with the path, that the applicant respectfully requests that the condition, if the board is so inclined after the testimony this evening to make it a condition of approval that it be public, make the condition read so that if the city is unwilling to agree to take on the liability, that the pathway can be created as a private pathway as currently shown on the plans. So in connection with these points, we have two remaining witnesses to testify this evening. First, our landscape architect, Brian Leff from BML Studio. He's going to, as I indicated, discuss the rendered landscaping plan, walk you through our landscaping details throughout the site, and he will address the alternative design for the path if it were to be made public. And then lastly, our Keenan Hughes, our planner, will discuss the planning justification for the project, the WRA requirements, the specific design requirements as they relate to this project and how the project complies with those requirements and which design exceptions we're seeking are warranted. And he will also discuss, as I mentioned, those Cookman Avenue renderings and the site orientation of the buildings. So at this point, unless the board has questions for me, we'd like to go directly to our landscape architect for his direct testimony.
Mike Manzella, can I have a quick follow-up question? When you say make it public, do you mean access to the public or public right-of-way?
So it would be essentially a public right-of-way. There would be a public easement that's created so that any member of the public would have access from that path to get from one side to the other.
Thank you.
And I had a quick, this is Alexis Taylor, board member. I had a quick follow-up question. Could you clarify, I understand that what you showed of the corner park is conceptual, but the final design is subject to review and approval by whom?
By city council, yes. So I can explain that again because it is a bit confusing when it comes to jurisdiction in this respect. So the park aspect of the plan for purposes of this board is considered one of the remainder lots. It is not, the park itself is not part of this site plan approval that we're seeking from this board. The only approval in connection with that lot that we're seeking from this board relates to the specific subdivision to create that piece of property that will ultimately be utilized for the park. The park itself, however, is a requirement under our subsequent developer agreement with City Council. So we are bound by that agreement to provide a park. And with respect to timing, I wanted to note for this board that it's important in terms of your overall consideration of this site because the park will exist prior to or at the time of completion of the first of the 3 townhouse buildings. So there will never be a point in time when the townhouses exist when the park doesn't exist. The only caveat being that we're showing you what the park could look like, but we have to explain that it's for illustrative purposes because we don't have control over that design. If city council wants something slightly different, or if we want to move in a different direction, that will be subject to their review and their approval. But we simply wanted, this board to understand and appreciate that there will be a park that exists and that will provide that necessary separation from Cookman. And I think, or we think, will give the board what it's looking for in terms of creating a nice focal point, specifically as you're walking along that Cookman Avenue corridor, and to address some of the concerns that the board had raised with respect to what it would look like.
Okay, understood. I just think for the record, it's important that if it does go back before, and it will go back in front of city council, I just think that any public park should be subject to public comment, and through the council process, it will be subject to public comment. So
agreed, absolutely.
And if I might take one moment to characterize something slightly differently. It's not the separation of the buildings from Cookman, it's actually the engagement of the buildings with Cookman. So we're not looking to have the buildings more, my concern, let me characterize my concern, is that the buildings are more engaged with Cookman and not more separated. And that, I think, is the so I want to be careful about how we characterize that, because we're not looking to create separation. We're looking to bring the public realm and the private realm together in this location.
Agreed, and that's essentially why we are proposing or actually thought of the idea for the park in that particular location, because we thought that that could absolutely bring that connection there. So that was a poor word choice on my part, but I completely agree with you, and that is absolutely the intention for that corner.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
I guess you're the first witness.
Okay, so I'd like to call our landscape architect, Brian Leff.
Yes.
Oh, there he is.
Mr.
Okay.
Leff,
Here he is.
Raise your right hand. You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your name for the record and spell it, and give us your affiliation with the applicant, and your attorney will ask you some other questions.
Sure. My name is Brian Leff, L-E-F-F. I am the landscape architect on this project. Graduate from Rutgers University at Cook College with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Planning and Design with an option in Landscape Architecture. I'm currently licensed as a landscape architect in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and as a professional planner in the state of New Jersey. I've provided testimony throughout the state for both landscaping and planning issues, including Asbury Park in the past. And I am currently the president of BML Studio in Barnegat, New Jersey.
And I'd like to move that the board accept him as an expert in the field of landscape architecture.
Yes, we will.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Leff, can you please describe for the board the rendered landscape plan for the project and how it relates specifically to the proposed landscaping for the project?
Sure. What I'd like to do at this point is share my screen, bring a copy of the rendering up. Presume everyone can see that now. So throughout my testimony, I will be referring to this plan. This is Exhibit A11. It is a color rendering of the landscape plan that was submitted, along with some photographs of various plants that are being proposed to demonstrate the diversity that we're proposing for the planting. The goal of the landscape design for this project was to provide an attractive year-round appearance with an emphasis on the use of native plants, which are tolerant of the salty and sometimes windy conditions that dominate the project area. Significant landscape design changes have been made to the plans through the municipal approval process. The original planting plan presented to the TRC relied more upon the use of exotic and ornamental shrubs such as hydrangeas, Coosa dogwood, liriape, and fountain grass to provide an attractive appearance, similar to other residential properties throughout the city. Based on the recommendations from the TRC, we took the opportunity to meet with the board planner and discuss the plant palette for this particular project. This was a productive meeting that resulted in a lot of major changes to the plan. These included the use of more perennial plantings, elimination of plants such as fountain grass, which have recently been added to the invasive species list, Coosa dogwood, and arborvitae, which have all become, frankly, overused just about every community throughout the state. The overall plant palette was revised to provide more use of native plants, which are appropriate for this particular application. Perimeter plantings, especially along the eastern property line, were also significantly enhanced as a result of that meeting. Another major revision that was made was the reduction in the amount of lawn area on the property in favor of additional planting beds. And finally, we chose larger shade trees to be installed along the interior driveways in place of the smaller, more ornamental trees that were originally proposed. All proposed landscape plantings will be irrigated, which will help to mitigate the salt that accumulates in the soil, and will also help keep the landscaping looking good over time. The landscape design includes areas of screening along the track perimeter, including the area adjacent to the public open space to the south. And it also includes lush plantings around each of the residential buildings. Larger deciduous and evergreen plantings are provided along the southern property line, where it gives a visual and physical separation to the public open space. And by separation, I just mean it keeps the two properties physically apart. We've provided a substantial amount of landscaping around the residential buildings. The sides of the buildings are densely landscaped with a variety of plantings, which include small ornamental trees, evergreen and deciduous shrubs, colorful perennials, and several types of native ornamental grasses. This is best demonstrated at the entrance along Heck Street, where the end plantings of the north building and the west building come together to form the entrance, and you have a nice attractive planted entrance. The interior roadways are lined with large honey locust trees, as well as smaller ornamental plantings in between the driveways. Each unit is provided with a small patio area at ground level. These patios will face the exterior of the development, and this allows for the interior of the development to be used for vehicular traffic. Patios that are associated with the eastern building will be adjacent to the private green space, and patios associated with the north and west buildings will be located adjacent to Asbury Ave and Heck Street, respectively. The area between the private patios and the public sidewalks along the roadways will be landscaped with a 42-inch semi-open metal fence with plantings of Skyrocket Juniper located between the fence and the patio. The proposed buildings have been designed with generous windows in accordance with the Waterfront redevelopment plan. With the units located approximately 10 feet from the public sidewalk and windows at eye level, residents may feel like they're living in a fishbowl. They're going to be highly visible even when they're in their own private home. In the applicant's experience with urban and semi-urban development, it's critical to provide privacy for ground level residential units. The original plan included a 5-foot fence immediately adjacent to the public sidewalks along the roadways, with lower ornamental plantings provided behind it to spice up the patio areas. At the request of the TRC and some other feedback that we received, the fence height was subsequently reduced to 42 inches. This left a gap where the privacy was being compromised. So to compensate for that, we changed the planting scheme and went from the lower plantings to the Skyrocket Juniper. Now, for those that aren't familiar, Skyrocket Juniper is a medium textured, narrow leaf evergreen, and I apologize if that sounds very technical. But it is one of the few salt-tolerant plants that'll grow to the height that's sufficient to provide any kind of privacy for the residents, and for the residents to remain, for the plants to remain narrow enough to grow in the limited space that they're growing in. The pyramidal shape will result in a filtered view from the streetscape, buffering the views into the units as opposed to providing a solid wall. So it's a softer look than having the original fence. In my opinion, this is an attractive solution to maintaining privacy for the residential units and also keeping the units looking good from the streetscape for the public. Now, this design provides a green space adjacent to the rear of the eastern building, which has been referred to as Building 3 in the past. This area consists of small pockets of lawn intended for passive use by the residents, and a private walkway which provides access to the residential units, and screen and ornamental plantings to enhance aesthetics. Plantings in this area include small groves of small caliber native shade trees, which will grow and form nice large attractive canopies. That's actually a feature that was recommended by the board planner. I happen to like it a lot. Native plants such as low bush blueberry, arrowwood viburnum, bayberry, summer sweet clethra, and little blue stem are being used to provide residential scale plantings along the entire eastern fence line. The proposed fence along the eastern line is 6 feet, and it's a coarse wood lattice, if you can envision that, almost like the top of a typical fence where they have the lattice top, but the whole fence is lattice. There are small sections of the fence along Cookman Avenue and Asbury Avenue that were originally proposed to be 6 feet, and I believe the plans currently show it at 6 feet. But based on the feedback that we got from the last hearing, we're also agreeing to lower those fences to 42 inches. So it would be the same wood lattice fence, just at a 42-inch height to match the height of the fence that's going around the patio units. Gates are provided at the north and south ends of the private sidewalk, which will be similar in appearance to the overall fence. And that just limits the access as to who can get into the property. We are currently showing 2 benches along that walkway, just for the residents to have some place to sit. Now, during the previous hearings, and Ms. Porter had alluded to this in her opening statements, the board expressed interest in having the private walkway available for public use. And we've given that request some serious consideration, and the applicant has agreed to provide a public walkway that connects Asbury Ave and Cookman Ave. But as mentioned, this does require some changes. Now, to accommodate this request, what we would be looking to do is right along the eastern property line, if you can follow where the little hand is on the page, we would be putting in a 4-foot wide sidewalk. 1 foot off of there, we would put a 6-foot high screen fence that would run the entire length of that property. The existing curved walkway that we're showing now would then be straightened, pretty much in the same spot, but just be straightened out. And the area that's left between the private walkway and the border fence would accommodate all of the landscaping that's currently shown there. It would just be rearranged to fit the new planting space. So it would look substantially similar to what we're proposing. It would just be slightly different arrangement of plants. Now, as far as street tree compliance, we are not proposing any new street trees for this application. The street trees, in accordance with the Waterfront redevelopment plan, currently exist along Heck Street and Asbury Avenue, with the exception of a few street trees along Heck Street that are going to be removed to create room for the driveway. And I think it's 1, maybe 2 trees in this area. All the street trees are going to remain. So those 2 streets are going to remain in compliance with the Waterfront redevelopment plan. And trees along Cookman Avenue will be planted once the overall streetscape improvements are put in place. And as I understand, Ms. Porter went through, there are milestones that need to be hit before that happens, but it will happen. In my opinion, the proposed landscape is appropriate for the development, and it's consistent with the current and desired appearance of Asbury Park, and is fully consistent with the requirements of the Waterfront redevelopment plan. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Jim Henry, I've got a couple of questions for you, Mr. Leff.
Fantastic.
I can't see on the exhibit you have here where the property line is along the west side of the proposed development. Can you indicate where that is?
On the west side?
On the west side, yes.
The west side is right at the edge of the sidewalk. We have these, it's tough to see that there's a fence right there, but then there's plantings on the inside. So where you have the sidewalk, this line right here, it's the fence, but that represents the property line. And then the plantings and the individual patios are inside of there.
Okay. Okay, and now go over to the east side and explain again what you're proposing here in the way of a right-of-way for the along the east side.
Sure, and this won't be to scale. And I'm only going to do this for a demonstration purpose on a small portion so that it's easier to see. But what we're talking about is right now, if you look close, you'll see that there's a fence right along the property line there, and all the plantings are immediately adjacent to it. What we're looking to do is put in a 4-foot sidewalk right against the property line. Right about a foot off of that sidewalk, we're going to install a 6-foot fence.
In other words, you're going to remove the fence from the property line now, move it back 6
Shift
feet.
it about 5 feet.
5 feet to the
About 5 feet into the property.
All right.
And then what we're going to do is take this walkway, because we're starting to get low on space. And when you try and meander a path through a narrow space, it just looks more like a mistake than anything else. So my recommendation at that point would be to get rid of the curves and just have a secondary path inside that's completely private. And that secures the residential properties and gives them that safe feeling that they're looking for.
Why is that necessary?
Because all of those units have access to the rear. They have their patios there. They have a walkway that goes out to the back. If you don't put a walkway there, everyone's forced to just walk across the grass, and whether it's snow, rain, mud, hot, there's not a solid surface to walk on, not to mention a handicap accessible route to the back of those units.
Why not just extend the walkways into the front doors of these buildings out to your new sidewalk?
I think that is one possibility that could happen, but you would end up with individual gates all along there, or openings all along that walkway. That would kind of defeat the purpose of separating the public walkway from the private space.
You think?
In my opinion,
They'd be about 50 foot apart, would they not?
No, because you're going to end up with two sidewalks coming out for each unit. I suppose you could combine them together to give a single gate for those two, but it would still be a lot of breaks in the fence that really aren't necessary.
But why are two sidewalks necessary?
Because one's public and one's private.
I understand that, but here you're putting in another layer of impervious surface to cause more runoff. You have a problem already. To me, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense.
Right. So that goes back again to the separation between the public improvement and the private. To the extent that there's access ways and we're combining the public and the private, it's very difficult from a liability perspective, from an easement perspective, or otherwise legally to separate the two. And the big overriding concern here all along for the applicant has always been the safety and security of those residents. So we certainly recognize and understand and appreciate the desire of the board to create that public access way. However, we have to couple that with the applicant's concern to protect the safety and security of the residents and allow them their own adequate access. And so the most appropriate means to do that is what's being shown here, to create that separate pathway to those units so that you don't have individuals from the public traversing directly adjacent to the rear entrances to those properties. It's a marketability issue, it's a safety issue.
They are not rear entrances, they are front entrances. Their front doors are where these walkways lead. And you're sacrificing environmental considerations for what?
For a great public benefit, which is the public walkway that the board had requested and raised.
So this is Eric Gallipo, and I want to sort of dovetail off of Jim's concern here, which is mine will come at it from an urban design perspective. And I think we can all recognize that the best way of keeping a public space safe is through high levels of usage of every citizen, and putting all of those doors and gates on that public access way is one very specific action that the applicant could take to make that access way feel as public and as surveilled and as safe as possible. Putting all of the usage onto the public access way is going to make it feel like it belongs to everybody. Extending the front doors, and I agree with you, Jim, that these are the front doors of these units, extending the paths from the front door all the way to the public access way will create a sense of public ownership, of public access. Separating them does exactly that. It separates it. And I think that, again, this is the result of the subdivision plan driving a desire to create a separation between the public and private, when the intention of the waterfront redevelopment plan is to create an engagement with the environment that is not being demonstrated.
Just to respond to that, again, this is being done in the interest of allowing and creating that public benefit to this parcel, that in addition to the park space, which is clearly being created and will be created for the benefit to the public, this allows that continuity between the parcels. However, that has to be balanced in connection with the marketability of those units, the safety and security of those units. And so we've taken that into consideration, which is why we've derived this particular drawing. And that's why it's so critical from a liability perspective that, the only way that the applicant can agree that this could be made public is for the city to assume liability with respect to that feature. We all recognize that there are ongoing safety and security considerations. We can't turn our back to the fact that that is something real and something that exists. And we are more than happy to create a public benefit to this parcel by virtue of this path. However, one of the considerations we have to look at is, how we continue to create and describe the units in terms of the private space versus allowing for that significant public benefit by virtue of cutting through the middle of the triangular parcel.
But the typical function of small cut-through paths like this aren't just cut-throughs. They are ways for residents as well to get from their unit to the public right-of-way, in this case, Cookman Avenue or Asbury Avenue, or if you go through the interior to Heck Street. And so keeping that pathway safe and keeping it feeling public and accessible is dependent on the highest level of usage. And by taking your residents, the private residents, and giving them a separate pathway and taking them off of that actually reduces the sense of safety that the public would have on this pathway. Having more gates on it and more openings is exactly what's going to make it feel more public. And making residents use that path to get to Cookman Avenue is what's going to make that path feel public.
The applicant respectfully, disagrees. We feel that the best alternative that can satisfy both the board's, considerations in terms of allowing the path to be public, while at the same time recognizing all of the considerations that the applicant has raised, since the very beginning of this process. We went before TRC. We discussed this exact issue with City Council. They both allowed the plans to proceed, showing it as a private pathway.
In this configuration, though, how many feet will there be along the public pathway without an exit or an entrance? It will be the entire length of the pathway from Cookman to Asbury, with no way of anybody getting on or off that path. That's not safe for the public.
Mr. Leff, I have another question for you.
Yes.
Let's assume for a moment that the public pathway is going to be constructed between Asbury Avenue and Cookman Avenue. Do you think that a 4-foot wide sidewalk is going to be sufficient?
Yeah, 4 foot meets the ADA requirements for a public sidewalk.
Yeah, I understand that. That wasn't my question. My question was, do you think that's going to be adequate? If two people walk side by side, they take up a 4-foot sidewalk. How about if there's 3 people walking? One walks behind?
In other directions.
4 foot sidewalks are very standard in residential areas. It's proven to be an adequate width for pedestrian circulation in just about every environment.
How about Asbury Park?
Asbury Park, I'm sure there are 4-foot sidewalks. They're not along the main roads, but this is the main road.
Have you checked the sidewalks in Asbury Park?
Cookman and Asbury are both main roads.
Yes, they're both main roads, but the area in between is not a main road.
My
This
question
is a secondary path. This is not intended to be a primary path.
But there used to be public right-of-ways in the form of Sewell Avenue and St. James Place that bisected this site, creating pathways through. And this created a larger block, which made it hospitable for development.
And that's an issue that's best.
Those were also vacated in connection with the ongoing development and the creation of this area.
And those are issues that are going to be best addressed by the planner and not necessarily through the planting design.
Correct.
Right, our planner can specifically speak to this issue, and, you know, to the extent that it causes a great concern for the board, the applicant is also willing to remove the pathway entirely and keep this as lawn area if environmental concerns are overriding with respect to the pathway. We feel that this plan, as shown, best can achieve both the public and private benefits in connection with this area of the property. But, you know, to the extent that we're creating an issue in terms of with respect to liability or with respect to safety and security, you know, would be the applicant's preference simply to remove this from the plan.
Can I ask a clarifying question about what's being proposed? So the private walkway will have a gate at the fence at Cookman Ave with another path, and then the public walkway will also be connected to the Cookman Avenue sidewalk. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. No gate on the public path.
Right. You know, I'll just, you know, say that I think, you know, the public sidewalk should be at least 5 feet. Just from a, you know, strictly pedestrian perspective, what we have experienced in Asbury Park and the volume of pedestrians, even on a secondary street, I think it's got to be at least 5. 6 would be even preferable. Just my 2 cents.
And keep in mind that the path that we have going through the site now, I believe, is a 4-foot wide path. And that's the path that everyone was requesting to be made public. So it was always a 4-foot wide path.
Right, except at that time it was only accessible to the private residents. So
right, and
making it public, I think you may have some more foot traffic, and it really deserves to have a little bit more space. That's just my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
John Moore, can I ask a couple questions, Mr. Leff?
Sure.
Okay, let's start on the Asbury Avenue, the north building. So you started off with the 5-foot fence and you went down to 42 inches at TRC. So you lost 18 inches. So you're putting these trees to block some of the views. How big are these trees going to grow?
You're talking about along Cookman and, let me just get rid of these.
Along
lines
Asbury.
here.
Along Asbury.
Along Asbury?
Well, along any place where you lost a 5-foot fence and you went down to 42
That's what,
inches,
we're talking about this little stretch right here on Asbury. Between where and actually it's going to be less than that, because if we put in the sidewalk, that new fence is going to be right about here. So you're talking about an area probably about 10 feet on Asbury, maybe 15 feet. That would be the same height as the fence going around the individual patios.
Right, that's what
Same
I'm talking
thing
about.
on
Okay.
Cookman. You're only talking about this little stretch here.
No, I'm talking about the entire project. You went from a 5-foot fence to a 42-inch fence.
Okay,
You lost 18 inches. How big are the trees going to be to make up this shield?
They're being planted at 5 to 6 foot.
Can you show us a picture of those? Better than this. Better than this.
No, I do not have a picture of the Skyrocket Juniper. If you're familiar with an arborvitae, it looks a lot like an arborvitae with a grayish blue color and a little bit more narrow.
When I say a picture, how close together are they going to be planted?
They'll be planted about 4 feet apart.
4 feet apart. With the goal for them to grow together?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to, can you show us a picture of your 42-inch fence and a picture of your 6-foot fence?
They were included in the site plans. I do not have pictures of those fences. I believe our engineer went over that in detail in his testimony.
He did, but that was a month ago, so if I can dig through my package and find them if you don't have them. Hold on.
I can tell you that the wood fences are a lattice fence, so it's basically wood planks that are crisscrossed, and the fences around the individual patios are 42-inch high. They're a black metal, and instead of almost like a split rail fence, except the rails are made out of metal planks.
And the proposed new 6-foot fence on the other side of the sidewalk is looking like what? Since it's new and it's not in my package, what's that going to look like?
The 6-foot fence over on the eastern side of the property line is that wooden lattice fence.
Okay, thank you. The only thing I wasn't sure about, did you say on the east side project, building 3, I believe it is, what size fence is there? 6 feet or 5?
These are all
6 or
42 inches around the individual units.
Okay, including the east side on Heck.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Leff, again, Jim Henry. On the fence around the patio, exactly where is that location on each of these patios?
Okay, let me zoom in real close.
On the east side of that planting?
You're talking, yes.
Okay.
Right, if you follow along, here's the patio area.
Yeah.
Right adjacent to the building.
Yeah.
Here's the buffer planting, and then the fence is this dotted line right between the planting and the lawn.
Okay, and to the west of that, to the west side of the your buffer plantings that you described, what is that? It's just the edge of the edge of the lawn. I'm sorry, the edge of the patio.
Right where my cursor is. Yes.
No, to the right of, to the right up. Go back about half. Right
yes,
there.
That's just the edge of the patio.
Okay, and that is where the plantings begin. There's no fence or anything like that.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. The fence is on the outside of the.
And these buffer plantings that you just showed there, what are they specifically?
These buffer plantings are Skyrocket Junipers.
Okay, and do the Skyrocket Junipers lose their bottom branches like the Arbor Vitae?
No, they don't.
They don't. Okay.
This is Rick Lambert. I have a question. So on the western side of the development, can you show the Heck Street side? Okay, so these sidewalks from the unit, do they connect directly to the sidewalk on Heck?
Yes.
And is there a gate or anything blocking those sidewalks?
Yes, there will be a gate at each of the entry points.
So that layout is already, there's precedent for that style of design on that side. So it's not unrealistic to ask for that on the east side as well. It would match the same layout that the west side has.
Only that when you go along the street frontages, you only have about a 10-foot separation. So it's very appropriate to just run right out to the sidewalk. On the east side, you have a much longer distance to traverse. So in my opinion, it makes sense along the frontages to have direct connections to the sidewalk. But for these units back here, particularly when we're proposing a private green space, it makes sense to me from a planning perspective and a design perspective that you would want those residents to be able to come out onto their private green space and have their own access into that area. In my experience, it's never a good idea to invite the public into a private property, unless it's like a apartment building where you have a single grand entrance or a hotel or something like that. But for a townhouse or a single family or duplex, public coming onto private property, and Jen, our attorney, had alluded to this, it creates a lot of legal issues as far as liability and security.
But townhouses typically face streets and have entrances on streets. And so that relationship between the public and private isn't quite so frustrated as it is in this application on the east.
And again, I think the planner is best suited to address the relation between the public and private.
Right.
In this case, in my opinion, this is a townhouse development where you do have direct frontage for 2 of the units, 2 out of the 3 units. To have the third unit facing the back, in my opinion, I still consider the driveways the front of the units, but if we want to consider the front entrance at the rear, I I think that just bolsters the argument to have a private walkway that goes to them, in my opinion.
Front doors.
Okay, well, we can definitely take up this layout situation with the planner. I understand you're really more concerned with the landscape materials. So
That's correct.
I appreciate you going over that. Is there any questions from the board professionals?
No.
Any other questions from the board members before we move on to the public questions?
Sorry, Rick, it's Donna. I was still muted.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand testimony about the plant materials. In our report under 4.4, do you have any comments about the recommendations we made? I mean, I understand your desire to keep using the Skyrocket. I think the plan would suffer from a little diversity in that plant material. Those can get pretty cranky when they're pruned that hard and in that tight environment.
I did review the letter, and for the most part, I really didn't take any exception to it. If I recall,
Yeah, I mean, specify some cultivars for the other stuff.
Exactly.
Get some diversity in the hedging. I think that would make us happy.
Yeah, the only area I took exception to was I really feel strongly that they do need some privacy in those units. So if we could stick with the Skyrockets, that would be the preference. Everything else is
yeah, and we think that dwelling units that front on a public street should treat the public street like their front yard, just like the rest of the houses in Asbury Park, and shouldn't be so secluded. That's why we're suggesting lower material or finer material that gives a little peek into those front yards.
I think most of the residential properties in Asbury Park, you have your front windows more than 2 feet off the sidewalk. I think there are plenty of condo buildings that do have this situation, but their floor areas are generally raised up a little bit higher than the sidewalk, so you're not staring directly into the windows as you will be in this case.
Agree to disagree, up to the board.
And we can go back and provide some diversity, but I think that some screening along there would be very, very helpful. I think it would be a mistake to lower all of the planting, but to maintain some critical areas of screening and incorporate some diversity along plants, we could probably work with something like that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Jennifer, we're getting some feedback from your computer.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to make a comment, but should I just, it's so loud. Can I make a comment or no? Maybe if I back up? No. Am I muted?
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, I don't know why I'm just doing that. This is Jen Souter from the board as well. I just wanted to ask because all the plants that we're talking about right now, that's a monoculture of Juniper Skyrocket, right, on both sides?
Yeah, what we're discussing now is the Skyrocket Juniper along Heck Street and Asbury.
So, and when you're talking about screening, the original opening of tonight, I thought we were saying the screening was going to be not like a wall, but more of partial screening.
Yeah, what ends up happening, because Skyrocket Junipers are pyramidal in shape, when you pack them together, the bases get nice and tight, but the tops, you still see the points. And that's really what's going to be sticking out. So what you're going to see is points with spaces, gaps in between on the top of it. And that's what will filter the view into the residence and not completely block it.
Mr. Lift, Jim Henry again. On the junipers, what's their normal mature height?
The mature height, they can get pretty big. They'll want to grow to about 15 feet, but they can be pruned down to any size.
Thank you.
Elon, what size are you putting in?
5 foot.
I didn't hear the answer to that.
Oh, the plants, we're putting in 5 foot tall plants.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions from the board? Okay, we'll take questions from the public. Irina, I'll let you take over.
I do not show anyone raising their hand at this time. Just to reiterate, if you would like to ask a question of Mr. Leff, please click on the raise hand button or on your telephone *9. Okay, I do have one person, sorry. Let's see if I can unmute her. Okay, go ahead, Barbara. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, my name is Barbara Krizak, 309 Lake Avenue, member of the public. I just have a few questions on the driveways. As you're coming into the driveway from Heck towards going east, will the plantings that are at the end of that at the end of that road be high enough to block any lights coming from the cars? Headlights?
Oh, yes, but the only way you're going to get, oh, you're talking, okay,
Yes.
heading east. Yes, actually, you're going to end up with a 6 foot solid or 6 foot fence along the property line and also some larger trees along there. So you will have, the fence itself would be an adequate block, but the plantings in front of the fence are going to block it even further since it is somewhat open.
Right, because the concern would be whatever the future development would be there.
Yep.
Whatever
No, that was actually the prime reason for locating this grove exactly where it's at. So that as you're coming down this driveway, your headlights are going to be blocked by the plantings and the fence there. And the same thing the other way, down the other way, when you get to the public lot, we have some tall evergreens and dense shrubs that as you're driving down the north-south driveway, you also have screening of the headlights. So it never shines on the Cookman or the public open space.
Okay, and if you're going north, then your headlights are really going towards a garage, so that would not really have an issue, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, I have another question about the streetscape. I know that Ms. Porter had mentioned about the streetscape and it's the master developer responsibility once we hit 50%. That would trigger it. Here's my question is that if for whatever reason that lot, that the remainder lot that is not developed, that is not part of this project, is sold to someone else, are they still bound by making sure that Cookman Ave gets the streetscape that it deserves?
That's a master developer obligation that would stay with the master developer regardless of who that lot is sold to. That would continue to remain with the master developer, so yes.
Okay. And my third question has to do with the sidewalks that we're talking about, whether public or private or both, or if there are two sidewalks. Will that material that those sidewalks are created of be pervious?
At this time, I don't believe so. I believe they're proposed concrete sidewalks.
Is there any reason why they can't be pervious?
I would have to look into that. I'd have to discuss that with the engineer. Sometimes there's soil issues, drainage issues, but I don't know the answer whether it could or could not.
And because as you can see that there's a lot of concern about pervious and whatnot. That's why I'm asking that question.
Yeah, permeable pavement, it's great for drainage. I love it, except for its maintenance characteristics. Because of the way porous pavements are constructed, they have very tiny pores where the water drains through. Those pores get clogged very easily, and it tends to defeat the purpose of the permeable pavement unless it's maintained and vacuumed constantly.
All right, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. If there are no more public questions, we'll move on to the next witness, Ms. Porter.
I don't show anyone else, Rick. This is Irina. Go ahead.
All right, Jennifer, up to you.
Great. So at this time, we'd like to proceed to our next witness. Mr. Hughes.
And please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear the testimony about to give in this matter read the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, I do.
Please state your name for the record and spell it.
It's Keenan Hughes, Hughes.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Hughes regularly appears in front of this board. I'm happy to have him go through his qualifications for purposes of qualifying him unless the board agrees to accept him in the field.
That's fine. We agree to accept him. I know he's testified before us.
Great. So, Mr. Hughes, can you walk the board through the the proposal for this site and the waterfront redevelopment plan and amendments as they relate specifically to this site, as well as the renderings that we previously discussed with the board as part of the opening?
Certainly. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a brief overview here from a planning standpoint. So I'm referring back to Exhibit A8, which was previously entered. This is just an aerial photograph, but again, provides some context for this particular site. It's a location along Cookman Avenue with frontage along Asbury Avenue and Heck Street as well. I know there's been extensive discussions about the overall plan, both for this property and then references to future development of the balance of the block. But this just provides some context, and I would say from a planning standpoint, I believe one of the roles of this particular block is to provide some connectivity, certainly from a pedestrian standpoint, in between the central business district and their waterfront. So providing that linkage, creating a pedestrian-friendly environment. I know that's something that we've talked about previously in this application. It's something that's referenced in some of the review letters. I think that's a common goal of both the applicant and the city in terms of bringing people to the waterfront and vice versa. The proposed use here with the townhomes, I suppose you could refer to them as stacked. They're really horizontally stacked townhome units. They are consistent with the waterfront redevelopment plan. The height of the proposed townhomes are also consistent. And just by way of reminder in terms of where we are in the process, as you know, this application has been before the TRC. It was approved by TRC with certain recommendations. Likewise, council as the redevelopment entity also approved the application. And furthermore, a subsequent developers agreement has already been entered into with city council. So this is a project that's already been extensively vetted by both the TRC and city council prior to coming before the planning board in the context of the subdivision and site plan application. So as the board is aware, there are several bulk variances requested in connection with the creation of the public open space lot at the corner. There's also a temporary lot frontage variance that's requested in connection with one of the three townhome lots. And I say that's temporary because, as we've stipulated, that variance will actually be eliminated once the project is fully built out and those three lots are consolidated into one overall lot. I gave testimony in support of those variances in the context of the subdivision application at the outset. I would just say for the record, nothing that's transpired in the context of the site plan application has changed my opinion in any regard. There's no changed circumstances, changes to the plan that would alter my opinion in any way. So that testimony stands, and I'm not planning to reintroduce that tonight in terms of direct testimony. So I did also want to just address some overall comments that we've we've received in terms of the overall layout and orientation of the buildings. And I'd also point out that TRC and council again did review the application, which did provide the same orientation, and a determination was made that the layout was compliant with the redevelopment plan, and certainly I share that opinion. And none of the requested relief that we're seeking in terms of those particular variances for lot size and frontage, or the architectural guidelines exceptions that we're requesting, are related to the orientation of the buildings. I would like to show the board a new exhibit, which is exhibit A17, which is pre-marked. I wanted to provide a little context in terms of looking at some similar layouts that actually exist in the waterfront redevelopment area or very near to it. And what you're seeing here, maybe I could zoom in just a bit, are 5 examples of residential buildings which have at some point side facades facing public right-of-way. So you have Vive is one example where you see the ends of the units here facing Kingsley Street. I think everyone's probably well aware of that project. The second example would be South Grand, which actually, I remember when this issue came up in the context of that application as well. The board determined at that time that the layout was also compliant with the plan. You can see here a couple of the rows of townhome dwellings which have a side facade facing Sewell Avenue. Thirdly is the example of Wesley Grove, where you have these residential arms of the building extending out to Lake Avenue. And then jumping up to Deal Lake Drive, just a couple of examples. Older buildings, Deal Lake Village Gardens, you have a couple of instances of side facades facing Deal Lake Drive. And then also Deal Lake Court, or excuse me, Deal Court, a couple of buildings likewise with side facades facing Deal Lake Drive. And I also included
examples, however, Keenan, if I may point out, in several of your examples, there are side facades facing public streets, but on the other public streets that those buildings are sited on, the majority of the buildings face public streets. So Vive does have some sides facing one street, but it has front doors facing 2 other major streets. Of course there are sides facing one street.
Okay, so I also provided a few photographs of each of these. So Vive, as you described, here's the side facade facing Kingsley Street. South Grand, this is the condition I referenced in that aerial photograph. And then here's the example of Wesley Grove along Lake. And then up to Deal Lake Drive, a couple of examples of where those side facades face out to the public right-of-way. So those are several examples from the existing context. And I think it's also worth pointing out in the context of just go back to the aerial photograph, in the context of the redevelopment plan, Cookman Avenue was not intended to be an extension of the CBD all the way to the waterfront. So there was never any requirement or vision to have continuous retail or other active ground floor space facing Cookman Avenue. But again, the real intent was to create a pleasant walking experience between those 2 areas. And having doors on the street is really not the only way to accomplish that. And I think actually Wesley Grove may be a good example of, an attempt to do that is arguably, at least in my opinion, not a great example. That to me is one of the most boring stretches of Cookman Avenue in the entire city. I mean, that is not a lively frontage, yet they do have doors on the street. So I just point that out as, having accessibility indoors is not a cure-all in terms of creating that pleasant pedestrian experience I think everyone is interested in. So turning back to our proposal, in my opinion, the proposed layout is perfectly appropriate and will actually enhance the pedestrian experience along Cookman Avenue. And as Jen mentioned in her introduction, we did prepare a concept of a conceptual view of the corner public open space, which is really intended to help create and enhance the pedestrian realm here. And again, I think this corner is one, when you have that experience of walking from the CBD to the waterfront, this is a prominent corner. There's a real opportunity, as we've described before, to create a visual focal point here. So this is exhibit A16, which is just a rendered view of what a park might look like in this location. Again, as Jen pointed out, ultimately any design for this park is going to be subject to city council review and approval. But here's one concept of how you could create a visual focal point here. And as you can see, the park becomes really where your eye is drawn. The buildings are somewhat in the backdrop, yet they're still engaging. They're still interesting from an architectural standpoint, just in terms of the varying the materials, the fenestration, and so forth. But I think having this open space here at the corner will go a long way in terms of creating that pedestrian-friendly experience that we're looking for, connecting the CBD to the waterfront. And in this way, I think the project does contribute to creating that environment, in particular by dedicating this lot to the city to create something along these lines. So just turning to the relief which we're seeking. Again, I mentioned the variance relief, which I'm not going to revisit in the context of this testimony, but we are requesting some waivers from the architectural design guidelines set forth in the plan. I'll just recite them to the board. I think they've all been identified in some of the review letters, but we have a waiver to permit sliding doors and windows where hinged doors and windows are required under the WRP. This aspect of the proposed application is present in other developments located throughout the waterfront. We have a waiver to permit windows installed flush with the outer surface of the facade. Again, this is another aspect which has been approved and constructed on other buildings. We have a waiver to permit frontage fencing, which is composed of metal instead of wood pickets. A waiver to permit frontage fences in a color other than white. A waiver to permit gray facades. A waiver to permit changes to materials other than along a horizontal line with the heavier material below the lighter material. And then also a waiver to permit different building materials than required. So in my opinion, I think we're looking at fairly minimal relief, just given how extensive the architectural design guidelines are in the WRP, and also recognizing the fact that the building that is being proposed here, the series of buildings, as was described by Mr. Minervini, this is really a contemporary expression of some traditional, more vernacular types of architecture that one would find on the shore. And so, in my opinion, some of the waivers that we're seeking really go hand in hand with the proposed architecture. And I would also just note that, these were identified in the context of the TRC review, and achieving compliance with these was not something that was strongly recommended or requested by the TRC. I think, I don't want to speak for the TRC, but I think there was some recognition that some of these elements really did go or were integral with the proposed design. But in terms of meeting the criteria set forth in the MLUL for design exception, I would note that achieving compliance with these particular design guidelines is impracticable given the contemporary architectural elements that are proposed and the construction methods that were described by Mr. Minervini. And the waivers that we're requesting, in my opinion, are within the purpose and intent of the architectural guidelines. So I think we're satisfying the real goal of the architectural design guidelines in the plan, and the specific waivers we're seeking are not significant within the scope of the overall project. So with that, that would conclude my direct testimony. the planning issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hughes. Are there any questions from the board?
Jim Henry, I have several questions for Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes, you, in your testimony, and Mr. Leff as well, made reference to approvals by a TCR. You're aware you made those statements?
Yes.
You're aware also that the TCR has no approval authority. They just make recommendations. Isn't that correct?
Well, I'll defer to legal counsel on that, but my understanding of the process has always been obviously.
I asked you because you made the statement.
Right, and I'm answering you, Mr. Henry. My understanding is that the TRC is the first step in the process, and we've always sought their approval.
It's a requirement. It is a legal requirement and a prerequisite for any application that is proceeding within the waterfront redevelopment area. So it is a mandatory step. Yes, their determinations are recommendations, but it is a mandatory step in that process, and it's outlined in the redevelopment plan.
That's not my question, Ms. Porter. My question was, are you aware that the TRC does not grant approvals? They make recommendations. Yes, no?
Is that question for me? I'm sorry, Mr. Henry.
Whoever wants to answer it.
Well, I would just say from a planning standpoint, we're here before the planning board, and obviously the planning board ultimately has to grant the relief that we're requesting in terms of the variances and the design waivers. You're right, the TRC does not have the authority, and correct me if I'm wrong, to grant that relief. So we are respectfully requesting from the board consideration of those items.
Mr. Hughes, the question is, are you aware that the TRC does not grant approvals? They make recommendations.
I think you just answered that, Mr. Henry.
He danced around. He didn't answer the question. It's either yes or no.
I think what I said was the planning board is the ultimate authority in terms of granting the relief that we're requesting.
Okay, fine. Next question for you, Mr. Hughes. You indicated that let me go back to my notes, I'm sorry. You indicated that, I think it's building number 3 that is on the southeast side of this development, and which is perpendicular to Cookman Avenue. Does that front on a street?
Does building through where the side facades are projecting out towards Cookman Avenue? I mean, the property does have some frontage on a street. Yes.
Okay, but that is one of the waterfront redevelopment requirements, correct?
No, not that I'm aware of.
No? Okay. You made reference to the subdivision that when this is finally constructed, that the when it is re-subdivided again, it's going to be one lot encompassing all 3 buildings. Is that what you said?
That's correct.
Okay. When that subdivision takes place, will that be when a certain number of units in this entire project are sold, or when will that take place?
I can answer that question. That will take place upon completion of the 3rd building. So once all of the units are constructed, then they will be remerged into one single condominium community.
Okay, so that subdivision is not going to wait until such time as the project is sold out. It's just going to be when it's constructed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and what's your definition of when it's constructed?
So upon receipt of the certificate of occupancy for the 3rd and remaining building, and the creation of the condominium community, that is when the applicant will then remerge the properties.
Upon the issuance of the certificate of occupancy on the 3rd building.
Correct.
Okay. Each one of these units has its own certificate of occupancy, correct?
Correct. Yes, correct. And each unit within the buildings, for the creation of the townhome units. So prior to the receipt of any of the units in the first phase, we have to complete the park phase of the building. And then upon completion of the third phase, that is when all of the 3 development lots will be remerged together to create one single condominium community so that the common areas can then be allocated appropriately to the unit owners.
Okay. I just want to clarify that because apparently in some of the other developments here in the city, this issue has been raised and it's getting to be I don't want to say a problem, but it's a problem. Okay.
Oh, and also I should note that the remerger is a specific requirement under the subsequent developer agreement, so it is an obligation as well.
Okay. And let's see. I think that's all my questions at the moment. I may have a couple when you come back.
Okay. Is there any other board member questions?
Yeah, I do have some questions. Mr. Hughes, this is Eric Gallipo. Mr. Hughes, can you pull up the 2 exhibits showing the aerial photographs of other developments?
Sure.
Okay. So on the just would you indicate on the Vive where the fronts of the buildings are? Front entrances.
Sure. We have front entrances along Asbury Avenue and First Avenue, and then along the internal Muse.
Right. Okay. So an internal Muse, and then you have front entrances facing 2 streets out of 3. Correct?
Meaning 2 out of the 3 streets
that it fronts on. Yes.
Yeah, I think okay. Fair characterization.
Okay, and then South Grand, similar situation. Correct. Would you describe and
what do you mean by similar situation? Is there a question? What do you mean?
Similar situation where you have one street frontage with sides facing and 2 street frontages with front doors facing.
Right. You have units facing
right
Monroe, Grand, and then
side doors.
Another Muse condition where you have 2 rows of townhomes facing this internal courtyard.
Correct. Right. Now, on both of those examples, what would you describe? Is there like are there main roads relative and side roads relative?
Meaning,
yeah, I mean,
what are you getting at? I mean, do you want to
if I were to look at the Vive, for example, in the upper left of this, it appears to me that the 2 major streets are Asbury and First Avenue. And the side street would be Kingsley in this case, although I know that's highly debatable, but you have 2 main streets and a side. In the South Grand, I would suggest that because Monroe and Grand are through streets, they would be the main streets, and is that Sewell is a side street. In Wesley Grove, it's a one-sided condition on Lake Avenue and a future 2-sided condition on Cookman Avenue. Did you also testify that Wesley Grove, you did testify, I believe, that Wesley Grove is not the best example in which to hang your hat on for how to enliven or activate a space?
Right.
Okay.
If I could just interject at this moment, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to get clarification for the record with regard to the orientation of the site and the buildings in general. So one of the things that we had talked about that were part of your opening statements to the board were that, some consideration needs to be given to the fact that this is different from a typical site plan application, meaning that this is in the context of a redevelopment area and pursuant to a redevelopment plan, which is in place, which allows for certain site configurations, including the fully compliant site configuration that's currently shown on this plan, which was previously approved and actually determined by resolution of City Council to be in compliance with the waterfront redevelopment plan. So I just want to confirm that for the record, that the plan as shown, the site orientation, that there has been a determination by City Council that that is in full compliance with the waterfront redevelopment plan. Is that correct? Is that the board's understanding as well?
Well, I think, excuse me, this is Rick Lambert. Yes, that is the understanding, but I think that there is the consideration of the subdivision of the lot, which contributes to the orientation of the buildings. And I'm not sure if that's where Mr. Gallipo is going, but it's my sense that that was where this was leading.
Right, and I think
that's correct. And I would suggest that the orientation of the buildings is being driven by the subdivision of the lots. Now, in addition to Mr. Keenan's point that doors on the street aren't the only way to enliven a streetscape. I would agree with you on that. Use is another way. Now, I understand. I understand you are not required.
Are you getting to a question, or are you giving comments?
I do. So in the waterfront redevelopment plan, is there a requirement to provide retail or any other use besides residential on this site?
No.
On this block?
No.
Is that correct, Ms. Porter?
That is correct. There are certain recommendations. There is guidance language within the waterfront redevelopment plan, but retail is not a requirement in connection
commercial.
with
I may have narrowly defined it as retail. I would wish to say commercial. I'm sorry.
The same would apply to commercial. It could be fully developed as residential.
Right. And how, okay. Well, if you suggest that these are not good examples, Wesley Grove, or then why replicate the problem on Cookman Avenue? And it just gets to the nature of the—
Well, can I just stop you there, because I think you're misrepresenting what I said, which was I'm providing these examples to illustrate that orientations of buildings that have a similar condition exist elsewhere in the waterfront, and in fact include 3 recently developed projects within the waterfront redevelopment area. My reference to Wesley Grove being not a great example was actually to show to the board that this frontage along Cookman Avenue, you know, it seems to me this might be something that you're trying to encourage and promote, which is having—
Eric, please let him finish his answer. We can't both talk at the same time.
It seems to me, you know, you might be preferring something like this, where you have actual doors and entries located along Cookman Avenue. I pointed to this as not a great example to illustrate to the board that that's not always the best solution, because my experience of this stretch walking here, I don't think I've ever seen a person go in and out of that building,
but you're not
area, and it's not a pedestrian friendly environment, in my opinion. So I think what we're proposing here with the open space on the corner, and then again, you're going to have the whole balance of the block to be developed in the future, is going to be a much more pleasant pedestrian experience. And I think actually having the visual focal point of the park here is even better than having a residential use that would be permitted.
I am in no way suggesting that the park is not of a good benefit. However, I am concerned that the orientation of the buildings will make Cookman Avenue feel like it's the side of this development and not feel fully engaged like it should be. I agree that Wesley Grove is too monolithic. There is not enough variation along.
Are you getting to a question, Eric?
However, I think it is wrong to characterize this site as having the same length along Cookman Avenue as Wesley Grove.
Now, Mr. Hughes, could you speak to the board question regarding whether or not the orientation of the buildings is what drove the subdivision, or with respect to the relief that we're seeking in connection with the subdivision, if that's separate and apart from, and you know, not a consideration with regard to orientation?
The line, if I may, I think the line of question is probably irrelevant. The orientation of the buildings has been approved.
Well,
by the development.
Jack, this is Rick. And I think that it is a relevant line of questioning because they're asking for a waiver, a variance for setback of the building on the eastern side. And that variance is predicated on
No,
the
there is no relief being sought for setback requirements. The only two variances there's 3 variances being sought in connection with the subdivision application. 2 of them specifically relate to the frontage requirement in terms of the length of that frontage. As Mr. Hughes explained, one of those relates specifically to one of the development lots. It's approximately 1.5 feet short of the 100-foot requirement, which will be a temporary situation because once the lots are remerged, upon completion of construction, that variance would go away. The only 2 remaining bulk variances and the only bulk variance relief for the entire application relate to the park parcel. One relates to the amount of frontage specifically for that lot, and one relates to the size of that lot. And that is it. There are no setback requirements or anything else contemplated in connection with this application, which is why, it's important for the applicant to keep repeating that the plan with respect to the orientation of the buildings not only was approved by City Council, but is fully compliant in terms of the bulk criteria.
Right. Okay. I apologize for my misstatement.
And I have one, Jim Henry, I have one further question for Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes, can you tell us what is going to go on that remainder of that triangular lot to the east of this project?
No, I can't, Mr. Henry. That has not been planned yet, and it's not part of this application. Obviously, it'll be a use that will be consistent with the waterfront redevelopment plan, but nothing has been laid out or contemplated at this time.
Just one follow-up question that, isn't it awful hard to plan something when you don't know what's going adjacent to it? You plan this building, I think it's number 3, one on the east side, and it doesn't front on Cookman. It doesn't front on a right-of-way. It fronts on a path that runs between Cookman and Asbury Avenue. How do you plan for a building like that that you don't know what's going to be across the sidewalk from?
So I'll let Mr. Hughes answer that, but before that, I just want to interject that, as part of the 2018 amendments to the Waterfront Redevelopment Plan, the city eliminated the need for block by block development, which allowed and opened up the ability of individual applicants to develop portions of blocks because it was viewed as being by the city as being a restraint essentially on development, because they wanted to allow for continuation of development. They didn't want that process to be halted or constrained by virtue of the need to create an entire block of development in order for things to get done. And so that's exactly what we're doing here. There are no current plans in place for the development of the remainder of that lot. However, we have a great plan in place for this portion of the lot, which is why we're presenting this as part of our application. We need to subdivide off this piece of the lot. We recognize that we had 2 remainder lots, one for future development, which is unknown at this time, and one with the remainder, as we described, for the public open space. But really, that was the reasoning here. And there, I can verify for the board, there are no current plans in place. To the extent that there was any even conceptual plans in place, we would advise the board of that.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Are there any other questions from the board?
If I can just build on that question with one more question. I think the only area where it may be relevant is because we are considering a public access, a public walkway basically through the block. If there were any plans to create that public walkway on the adjacent lot, maybe even more aligned with Berg Street, that might impact whether the board, considers the recommended change to incorporate a public walkway on this lot. That's the only I guess, point of clarification I'd like to hear about.
Well, what I would say with respect to the walkway, obviously we've been around and back on this issue. I think both the city, the applicant, we know where each other stands. I mean, it's a nice idea in theory, right, to provide some public connectivity there. However, it's not something that was contemplated as part of the waterfront redevelopment plan, which envisioned development across this entire triangular block. So it did anticipate development that would be at the scale of the full block without, providing any cut-throughs from a pedestrian standpoint. On the applicant side, what I'm hearing is that and this is, by the way, an applicant that's very, very familiar with the waterfront and the local market. They have real concerns about marketability, about safety and security. So, at the end of the day, they're the ones putting capital at risk to bring this project to the waterfront. So I think those concerns need to be respected only insofar as there's no public access way that's contemplated here. I mean, the plan was actually very thorough in terms of street openings, street closures. It even proposed a new Muse in one instance to provide more connectivity, but there was never a cut through that was envisioned for this particular area. So I think that's something that the board needs to keep in mind. Again, also recognizing the fact that this was, I know it was recommended previously by TRC and council, but it's not something that's in the actual documents that we all, collectively live by, developing and reviewing projects in the waterfront.
So thank
you. Is there any other questions from the board? Board professionals?
No.
Okay, do we have any questions from the public, Irina?
I don't see anyone with their hand raised. Let's give it one more second.
Sure.
Okay, no, I don't see anyone.
Okay. Do you have anything else, Jennifer?
Not for this witness.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess you have closing statements, Jennifer?
Yes, I do. Prior to my closing statement, did the board have any further questions regarding some of the issues that were raised at the beginning of the meeting?
Yes, this is Alexis Taylor. I think Jack alluded to that we would come back to the stormwater and the letter that you had provided from DEP. Was that what you were referring to, Jack?
Yes.
Because I do have questions about that. In particular, I think it's important to establish whether or not DEP's approval of a CAFRA permit, or not even approval, but finding of consistency with a previous CAFRA permit somehow disqualifies our board engineer's analysis of the stormwater system.
That's what it boils down to. Yeah, subsequent to this morning, I spoke with Jason, asked him to speak to Sean.
Yep.
And thoroughly review the letter.
Yep.
And figure these issues out. And I think he should testify because I think he has some answers.
I would love to hear from our board engineer on that.
Yeah, and also now we got to be careful because some of it may involve, and Jennifer, I need you to step in on this. It may involve telephone conversations between our engineer and members of DEP, which obviously could be considered hearsay. So in following through, not adhering to strict hearsay regulations and always trying to vet out all the interests of these applications before the board, I think we have to overlook the fact, unless there's some strong objection from you regarding that and some basis for it. I think we have to allow Jason to tell us what he was told and we have to get Sean in on this colloquy. I don't want to make it a traditional like trial type of situation where you're examining, cross-examining, getting really technical. What I really want to do is I want to get to the bottom of it. And I want to get the facts out,
Right.
where we really do stand with DEP. Is that letter completely dispositive of your obligation or any further obligations imposed by the board?
Right.
Does it help? Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say, we are okay with that approach. We certainly want to, address this issue for the record and resolve any open issues with regard to it. As I indicated at the beginning, we hold to what we stated in terms of the jurisdictional issues. And another important consideration that needs to be stated again is to go back to the difference between obligations relating to stormwater, which are set forth under the CAFRA permit, that relate to ongoing stormwater considerations within the waterfront redevelopment area, which are within the purview of the master developer. So that is a continuing process that will continue to happen irrespective of what's going on in connection with this application. And I think that it's something that's not necessarily taken into consideration when you deal with piecemeal projects. You deal with, Band-Aid effects to address certain specific spot issues without an overriding recognition in terms of what the master developer is doing or obligated to do for that matter with regard to stormwater. And so we're happy to entertain that dialogue, but we will interject where appropriate in terms of stormwater considerations that are already being undertaken or that will continue to be undertaken by the master developer in accordance with the master developer agreement, in accordance with the infrastructure component report, in accordance with the infrastructure plan, in accordance with the requirements of the existing CAFRA permit, which applies to the entire waterfront redevelopment area. Those are all very important considerations that need to be understood and taken into consideration in the context of this conversation.
Not a problem. Why don't we hear what these two professionals have to tell us, since they're the engineers and we're not. So let's start with Jason, okay, if you don't mind. Let's get Sean sworn as well at this point. Sean, I know you've been sworn in previous meetings. Please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear the truth, the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
And you are Sean Delaney.
Sean Delaney with Bowman Consulting.
Engineer for the applicant. You've already been sworn. We did all that. Jason.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you're under oath. Why don't you tell us about this letter and what you've come up with and what were the substance of your discussions with DEP and Sean for that matter?
So the crux of the stormwater management for the board's concern is water quality and water quantity. These are a couple of things that are considered by the DEP. And the letter that came out from the DEP, I believe it was dated July 1st. I reviewed that.
Has that been marked? That's A15?
That's A15, correct.
Okay, just want to make sure we have good record. Okay, sorry.
And while that letter itself carries a lot of weight and is valuable for the applicant and the city, I did have some questions for clarification. So I called the DEP to ask about that. And the 2 points that I wanted to discuss with them was water quality and water quantity. Water quality is the easy one. So the applicant has a requirement to, for lack, just to kind of sum it up real quick, treat the stormwater before it's discharged. And in this case, it gets discharged to the lake. The CAFRA permit that was issued years ago, everything is being done under that permit here. The waterfront redevelopment plan and the CAFRA permit go hand in hand. That CAFRA permit says that there are water quality units installed throughout the waterfront redevelopment area. Therefore, an applicant for development does not have to provide further water quality treatment because eventually their runoff will go through one of those units. So what we asked the applicant to confirm is that the 3 separate discharge points they have for this project will eventually pass through one of those water quality units, or there's 3 discharge points. So they're going to have to pass through 3 water quality units. I had a discussion with Mr. Delaney and he confirmed it, and he can confirm this again tonight for you, but for the sake of keeping this flowing, he confirmed that all 3 discharge points do eventually pass through water quality units. And he agreed to provide a map to us showing us where that happens. So assuming that's the case and taking it for face value, the water quality, as far as I'm concerned, is solved. The waterfront redevelopment plan is satisfied, the DEP is satisfied, and I'm satisfied. If the board has further questions on that, by all means, we can discuss it. Water quantity is another issue. So the DEP, their take on this, and again, based on my conversation with Chris Jones today. Chris Jones is a bureau chief at the DEP. He's the one that signed the July 1st letter. His take on it was the distance, so the project discharges to the lake. So the distance between the project and the lake is short, and the lake is very large relative to the size of the site. So with those two factors considered, the DEP figured that water quantity is solved. I understand the city's position to be, and in my experience, I feel that it might go a little bit deeper than that. We hear constantly with all different applications, we're constantly hearing about flooding issues in the waterfront redevelopment area and the lake. And this project is kind of hits both of those concerns. So we heard testimony last time by Mr. Delaney, which was very comprehensive, and I don't dispute any of the numbers or anything like that, that the 3 discharge points will increase the rate of runoff of stormwater. But in terms of the overall waterfront redevelopment area, Mr. Delaney stated that, in his testimony, stated that it was accounted for. What I believe that the city is looking for, and again, this is where the board should discuss, I believe that the city is looking to control water quantity better than that. They're going to look for sites like this to detain runoff, slow it down so that the infrastructure within the streets between this site and the lake, the capacity remains available for all the upstream properties to be able to flow through as well. And also to slow down the rate of discharge into the lake so that the lake can maintain its level without backing up into the streets. So Mr. Delaney and I discussed that one as well, and our conversations today kind of left open on that one. It's not my place to recommend a solution except to ask if the applicant could consider some method of attenuating runoff for the sake of water quantity and the conveyance systems and the lake. So that's where we left it.
And just before Mr. Delaney speaks to that point, I think this is an important point to discuss master developer obligations. So we just want to be clear whether or not, in the context of this discussion, the board is asking us to make concessions with regard to stormwater that actually relate specifically back to obligations between the city and master developer. So we recognize that flooding is an issue within the city and within the waterfront redevelopment area. And we recognize that there is an issue with Wesley Lake. We heard the testimony at the last hearing. We understand and appreciate that. Those are all things which are currently being addressed between the city and the master developer. And that is where the obligation arises and should essentially fall, because that is specifically controlled by agreements that are in place between those two parties. Those will globally address all of the considerations. So rather than address it to the extent that there can be additional fixes on this site, the master developer encourages and welcomes this board, not in connection with this application, but in general, approaching the city so that a global and more comprehensive fix can be achieved. And so that's really the point that we wanted to make before this board. It's not that the applicant is opposed to doing these things, it's just that these are master developer considerations, and we acknowledge that, appreciate that, and welcome the opportunity to work with the city to fix that. But by doing a Band-Aid fix in connection with this particular site, that's not going to resolve the issue. That's the whole point here. It's not going to resolve the flooding issue. It's not going to resolve the Wesley Lake issues. They are master developer issues that need to be worked out at the city level, and we're happy to do that and want to encourage that public participation in that process.
I I'm worried about the precedent that is being set here, and I agree with what Jason's testimony said about water quality. But in terms of quantity, I don't think you can kick the can to the master developer. And I have two statements to make about two questions to make about that. The first is, why are you not responsible on a site level in terms of your stormwater? That's deferred site by site to the master developer?
No, but when you look at the evaluation under the CAFRA permit, the CAFRA permit takes into consideration the entirety of development within the waterfront development area. And you look at the parameters that were set by DEP when the waterfront redevelopment area and plan was created. So it allowed for a certain amount of development. It was predetermined, a certain amount of residential units, a certain amount of impervious coverage. So that is the baseline by which we prepare our stormwater reports and our analysis. It's not necessarily done on a site-by-site basis. It's in comparison with the whole, because that's how the project was created, and that's how the project is reviewed. And then overriding considerations are built into the infrastructure component report, the infrastructure plan, and are undertaken by the master developer. The CAFRA permit specifically speaks to two things. And this is the point that I wanted to make at the beginning. It talks about an upgrade of the storm sewer system, and it talks about rehabilitation of the sewer lines within the renewal area. Those are two things that would specifically address the exact issue that the board is talking about in connection with this site, as well as all other areas within the redevelopment area. And that's really what we're getting at here.
This is
Except that sorry, Greg, go ahead.
Alexis.
Well, so beyond the CAFRA permit, which everyone is kind of deferring to as this like golden ticket, there's also an MS4 permit. And that does mean that the city has oversight over the overall system, and that they are required to and allowed to enforce things on a site-by-site level. So because this is a part of a master development, this site is excused from the water quantity obligation?
We're not saying that. We're saying that it's being addressed by the master developer, and that there are those considerations.
You did say that it's not being addressed by the master developer. You said that the city needed to renegotiate or something with the master developer and address it. It's not already being addressed.
Well, it's ongoing. It's part of the global redevelopment of the waterfront redevelopment area, which has occurred and continues to occur over the course of the past decade, and will continue for years to come.
So Jack, I'm not going to keep on arguing this. No, I really worry about setting a precedent in which on a site-by-site basis, we're not requiring the contribution that site is making to our stormwater system to deal with that quantity.
Jennifer, I'm in line with Alexis, the same theory of your question. I'm a simple guy, okay? Been at this a long time. Let's take the simple approach to this, okay? This project gets approved and gets built. Is there currently anything in effect that will deal with the quantity issue that's being raised? The three quantity issues, you talked about 3 points of quantity. You mentioned that there's discussions, or that there's a plan in effect or going into effect, or they're going to renegotiate. What effectively and factually happens after the board approves this and you build it? Where's the water going to go? Is there something in effect that's going to resolve these issues? Or is it we're just having a discussion, and at some point, perhaps down the road after the project's built and there's some flooding going on that we've now created by approving it this way, what have we resolved? You're telling me you want us to hold off, that there's going to be something. There's nothing currently in effect that's been built that will accommodate this water?
See, what we're trying to understand here, we view it as precedent as well, because there are specific obligations of the master developer. And the concern here is that you're taking obligations of the master developer, which were created under the redevelopment plan, and applying them on a piecemeal basis to the obligations
what we're really doing is we're trying to prevent a problem from occurring. The board has an obligation to prevent the problem from occurring. And if the master developer hasn't installed these improvements at this point, what's going to happen if this project gets approved and built? It's simple.
This is Rick. I have a question.
What's going to happen?
Has the board, though, approached the city with respect to these concerns? There have been specific discussions, even within recent weeks, between the city and the redeveloper. I don't know if the representatives from city council can
I would agree with that, except that we can only judge this application on the merits of this application. Jack is correct. We can't go with some conversation that's about to happen in the future.
Correct, but it's also unfair to put the applicant in a position to address things relating to the site that are specific obligations of the master redeveloper pursuant to other agreements with the city.
Yeah, but doesn't it come down from master redeveloper to subsequent developers and so on? Don't you have to live with what the master redeveloper has to do? You have to live with that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right,
And those
so
are obligations.
What I'm saying is if these remedial systems are not in effect, and we approve the project, and then there's a water problem, what have we done?
The whole point being that by addressing stormwater on this particular site in terms of quantity, as we're talking to, that alone will not fix the flooding problem. It will not fix the Wesley Lake problem.
This is Rick. I don't think that we're trying to have you correct those problems, but I don't think it's unrealistic for the board to expect the water that runs off of your site to be handled by your site. I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation. Regardless of what the master developer is going to do, if you're generating X amount of stormwater, us requiring or asking you to do something to mitigate that runoff is not, I don't think it's an unrealistic expectation. In the DEP approval, that to me is like the minimum acceptable that meets the standard, that meets the CAFR standard. But anything above that, I think we are, we have a right to say, well, you're generating this stormwater runoff. We would like for you to handle it on your site before it goes into our system. We're not asking you to solve the flooding that's occurring, that currently occurs. We're just asking you not to exacerbate it.
So,
Alan's got his hand raised.
if I may, maybe probably a good time to jump in and talk about this. Going back to when the CAFR permit was approved, obviously the site was analyzed and upgrades were done for the storm sewer system for conveyance to the outfalls, specifically in this case down at Wesley Lake. Water quality structures were put in, and the overall waterfront development area was approved at an impervious coverage of 90% or greater, and then about 10% in impervious areas. And that's what the whole system was designed to be able to handle and convey downstream. As we go through site by site, we are looking at the analysis of what the DEP ultimately approved back then, comparing it to what we're putting on our site right now, and seeing whether or not the runoff that we are proposing, we are generating under proposed conditions is exceeding what was originally planned for or is reduced from what we were planned for. In this case, the proposed discharge out of our site, we have a site that is less than 90% impervious, which was envisioned. And therefore there's less runoff coming off our site that's going into the conveyance systems that were designed to handle a 90% conveyance. So this is basically peak flows running off site going down into those areas. I testified previously or during the Q&A that came through that Wesley Lake, while is a tidally influenced water body, while it might not be tidal itself, Jason, that doesn't rise and go with tides, the outfalls are affected by, can be affected by the tidal influence of the Atlantic Ocean during storms, during flooding events, and those kind of things. The DEP does look at current regulations as they're reviewing our compliance letters to see if we are in fact compliant with the regulations. The one they have now started enforcing on another project as well as this one was demonstrating that the discharge off our site will not result in increased flooding downstream of our point of discharge. And as Jason pointed out for his conversation with Chris Jones, what Chris has relayed to him, as Jason pointed out, is that the close proximity of this site to Wesley Lake means the water that's coming off our property is getting into Wesley Lake quickly. That means it gets into Wesley Lake quickly, which means it can get out of Wesley Lake quickly into the Atlantic Ocean and discharge off site before the bulk and remainder of the upstream drainage areas travel down to and discharge into Wesley Lake, which have a much larger drainage area, much larger effect upon the level of the lake, the discharge off it, and during storm events, rain events, flooding events, potential flooding in the streets along Lake Avenue or other areas of the waterfront and of the city. So while putting detention and detaining flow and keeping it on site and holding it back and releasing it at a slower rate is desirable in many situations, I believe in this case, getting the water off our site more quickly and into the lake, instead of holding it back and timing it more with all of the upstream areas that are coming down and putting it into the pipes at the same time as those pipes are getting into it, would cause a larger effect in terms of the timing of the whole system. The time of concentration that we run, it helps analyze our calculations, our pipe calcs, our storm drainage calcs. It's related to the time it takes for a drop of water from the most hydraulically remote location to get to the end result. Therefore, an area that's on 4th, 5th, and 6th Avenues that flows to Wesley Lake is going to take a longer time. Just in general, if all things are considered, there's no detention on any property, it's going to take a longer time for that drop of water to get to the lake than it will for a drop of water on our site to get to the lake. So by holding our time back, now instead of our water getting to the lake well ahead of those further upstream areas, maybe all the water at 3rd Ave and those areas are now hitting the lake at the same time as our stuff, and now we're dumping more water at a time as opposed to spreading it out over a longer period of time. I'm not saying for this case, in this instance, because of the close proximity of the site to the lake, and that the outfalls are really coming off our property and coming straight, directly into the inlets are going directly into Wesley Lake. There's not a very long roundabout way. The only one is the one at Asbury Ave that goes down to the intersection and then comes around. But the one that runs down St. James off of Cookman and then the one at Heck Street are straight shots essentially down into the lake, that the faster the water gets in there, the faster it can get out of the lake and discharge out to the Atlantic Ocean, and allow the volume from the other storms, from the other drainage areas further upstream, the time to get down there. And then you're softening the, same thing as the pandemic right now, you're softening and lowering the curve that's for that height that's coming into the lake. By backing everything up and putting everything in longer detention times, you're taking it from a regional design that was really what the waterfront redevelopment plan and the original approval envisioned on a regional things, and you're basically now putting each one on each individual site and looking at them independently to make sure that they are compliant, which then could affect the developments on all the other pieces of the load if you look at each site completely independent and don't regard the overall master plan design or approval of the waterfront. You want to time these things out. So the essence is, in this case situation, you want the areas closest to the lake, you want the water to get into the lake quickly and get out before the time comes for those other areas and those other drainage areas further upstream. Those might be the areas where you want to hold things back, and with some infrastructure, some additional new infrastructure improvements or discussions with the city, there may be some other ways to help increase capacity of the pipes or do other things that can free up and hold back the water further away from the lake, so that the lake has a chance to come up real quickly and then start going down again before that next wave of water and runoff comes into that area. So with this, as I testified to, the analysis that we did, yes, there is an increase in runoff from existing conditions, but we're not comparing it to existing conditions realistically. Realistically, the existing conditions are the conditions that were approved for the previous CAFRA permit that we're guided by, because the flows and the pipes and the conveyance was all thought about at that time, and that's where we're going to look into it. The capacities that we looked at for this site, we did look at the capacity of the existing pipe system that we're tying into with the runoff that we are discharging off our site. And we were trying, the effect was will the 100-year storm off our site be able to be conveyed through a pipe system that was designed for 25-year storms? Based upon the analysis and the review of the original design that I looked at, that while we are slightly increasing the runoff to each of those inlets in the storm system, the pipes do have some additional capacity in them to convey the water from this site to the outfalls without resulting in any increase in flood damage downstream. And that's what the DEP was looking at, the potential increase of flood damage for the downstream points. And this it really comes down to the close proximity of this site to the lake, and how quickly the water gets off our site into the pipes and down into the lake, and then can get out of the lake into the Atlantic Ocean, where it ultimately discharges to.
So, Mr. Delaney, just to characterize your argument in short, you're arguing that there is capacity within a city system which you can contribute to rather than mitigate your own contribution on site. So it's similar to there's capacity for more garbage pickup and therefore you don't have to contribute to garbage pickup, or there's capacity for sewage and therefore you don't have to pay a sewage fee. You're arguing capacity rather than dealing with it on site. And you're also kind of banking on tailwind water, and that capacity and timing means that it will immediately evacuate when ultimately it accumulates, even as it's evacuating.
It does accumulate, yes, but the water that our site gets there quicker and will evacuate more quickly before the majority of the runoff that is coming to the lake from upstream areas gets into the lake.
Unless
And yes, the information, what I'm saying is that there is capacity to convey the runoff from our site to the lake in those pipes. I'm saying this is specific just to this application. I'm not making anything about the remainder site or another site nearby that could be redeveloped in the future. That has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis to determine if, when this one gets added into, if I look at the next development, if I've used the capacity up for this development, there's not capacity in another spot or not as much capacity, then I'm going to have to look at other options. And I agree with that. I'm saying that the analysis we looked here is that the capacity of the pipes and the quickness of how that can get to how quick the water can get to the lake is a positive on this application and this site development, versus trying to detain and hold water, which will then time up with other areas further upstream that will then all hit the lake at the same time and cause a more quicker result in a rise of the water level more quickly. That would have a potentially a larger impact. I don't know what that impact is, but it could potentially have a larger impact if anything, if there's some flooding in those areas.
But does all site detention methods, that doesn't necessarily deliver the additional runoff to the sewer, to the pipes? It could be recharge.
The DEP does not allow us right now to account for recharge in our quantity calculations to satisfy that condition. It has to be assumed that recharge fails. So we have to analyze it as if there's no recharge on the site, regardless whether there is or not. There is the elevation of the site's also where it is. The water table, I believe, we are close to the water table with some of that information. So in order to recharge, and I have to look at this a little more closely, it might result in having to raise the site, significantly, in order to provide the necessary separations that the DEP requires in order to recharge. So that there are other things going on in terms of the site as well, that we did taken a look at briefly, in terms of when we started the initial design. The analysis, like I said, that I showed, which was consistent with an analysis on a previous application that DEP reviewed and approved, was comparing the 100-year flow off the site versus the capacity of the pipes, and resulting whether or not there would be an increase in flooding downstream as a result of that. And my conclusions are that the testified that there's capacity in the pipes to handle that additional flow to get the water to the lake, and therefore the lake would allow that to discharge offsite and would not result in a significant increase in flooding.
Mr. Delaney, Jim Henry. What you seem to be missing in your overall analysis is the fact that the lake floods now without any development on this site. And what you're doing now is you're increasing the runoff from the site, which is going to exacerbate the problem of the flooding down below. And it's all fine to do all sorts of calculations and understand, but these calculations don't take into account what actually happens. In a perfect world, when they redid the stormwater system in the waterfront redevelopment area a few years back, all of the flooding problems would have been solved, but they weren't. I don't know why they weren't, but they weren't. And the fact of the matter is that the runoff from this site is going to create more of a problem than already exists. And I think that's the point that Eric is making, that Rick is making, that Alexis is making. I think that something has to be done in order to reduce the flow from this site.
And I'm saying that if there is flood, you're saying that flooding occurs in this area. I'm not disputing that. I did see the photos from the storm that came through on Friday from the news and showed some flooding. I did also visit the site on Friday. I didn't get there till after the storm went through, about 6:30 at night, where the lake was at, there was low tide in the ocean, or was near low tide of the ocean. I looked at the lake elevation. I drove along Ocean Avenue, along Lake Avenue to see if there was, what kind of flooding would occur. It's a tropical storm. It's a heavier event with surges in the ocean that would affect the discharges out of the lake, that could potentially hold more water in the lake and cause more flooding or longer flooding in the streets. I can say at 6:30, there was not one inlet that was surcharged along the ocean front or along Lake Avenue. There was water in the inlets, but it hadn't, backing up through the lake, but it hadn't surcharged up over the lake. That's not saying that there wasn't flooding at some point during that rain event and the storm.
What was the design?
But the whole point of being, with the lake and the discharge off of that, and then the oceans, if the increased tide and the surge potentially that could have affected the discharge off of that, within 6 hours after, or less than 6 hours after this, the road, everything was clean. The flooding was dissipated and there was nothing there, which is what the whole point of being in a flood hazard area, tidal flood hazard area, is supposed to happen. As the water levels rise, as the tides go down and water can get back into the ocean for whatever reason and go over spillways, the water dissipates, and that's the whole point of it.
What was the design flood level for your study?
I looked at the up to the 100-year storm.
And what was the event that passed through on Friday?
I was looking for that. I couldn't get it before the meeting tonight. I didn't find what the actual rain amounts was for the total.
I think it's about 1.6 inches.
But it came over a finite time period, so I have to equate that to a 24 to the 24-hour storm that we were looking for. So
I have a question for Jack. I guess is there any inconsistency created between the City Council amending the waterfront development agreement to allow site-by-site rather than block-by-block development, but then not allowing us to consider the individual impacts of site-by-site development rather than block-by-block?
I think the applicant here, just if I could interject, is not asking for block-by-block consideration. We're asking for already agreed upon agreements between master developer and the city that relate to the entire waterfront redevelopment area. And I think just to go back to Mr. Henry's point with respect to the lake flooding, the obvious solution to that is to address the lake itself. And so the question is, who is responsible for Wesley Lake? Who is responsible for the improvements in terms of flooding? So the question is, do you treat the issue by subscribing to making individual requirements for individual developers piecemeal, or do do you fix the system, which is already in place? And I think that that is the whole point here, that that these considerations are already being undertaken. So if there is a flooding problem with the lake, do you address that by looking at what's going into the lake, or whether the problem is with the lake itself? And so that is something, like I said, it's already a master developer consideration. It's already prescribed to, it's already agreed upon.
First and foremost, I'm going to answer Eric's question. Okay. Question was directed to me. What was your question?
Is there an inconsistency in the fact that the City Council amended the Waterfront redevelopment agreement to allow site by site rather than block by block development plans because it was impeding development?
Within the plan itself?
No.
What inconsistency?
It's inconsistent with the fact that now that we're considering one of those site-by-site developments, but we can't look at the impact that that specific site has on the overall stormwater system. Like,
well, let me you're talking a number of different issues. Number one,
that's why I'm trying to help you.
Okay, I get it. Okay, number one, the engineering issue we'll talk about separately. From the planning perspective, the City Council, in its wisdom, thought there should be an amendment to allow less than full block redevelopment.
Okay, fine.
It was sent over to the planning board for comments, which any amendment to any proposed redevelopment plan or anything, any redevelopment regulations must be sent over for recommendations and comments by the planning board. Planning board made its recommendations and the City Council voted it in as an amendment. It is what it is. There's nothing that we can say. We can't challenge that and say you did something wrong. Doesn't matter.
No, that's not what
I know. I'm just saying, I'm just vetting it. Okay. I'm just giving you my analysis. So in terms of whether or not there's any inconsistency there, it doesn't matter in terms of the planning aspect of it. In terms of the engineering aspect of the whole thing, that's what I'm trying to understand. Jennifer's saying that there's something there, but what you keep saying there's something there to address this with the master developer. What is it?
So it's all addressed specifically under the infrastructure component report. It's addressed under the infrastructure plan, which is in place for the entire waterfront redevelopment area. And
So
it's
the
something that
improvements,
systematically is being
installed?
put into place.
Are these improvements, are these engineering features installed already, or they're not?
So throughout the waterfront area, there are certain improvements that have been installed, certain improvements that are being installed, and certain improvements that will be installed. So it's an ongoing process and
Okay, so my
collaboration
question
as
then
the
becomes
redevelopment area.
Jason needs your help. If whatever's already in effect, does that help us? Whatever's being installed, will that help us? And when the ultimate installation takes place, will that resolve the problem?
I haven't reviewed any design calculations or reports related to that, so I can't answer that question.
Where do we go for answers?
Well, the applicant could quantify it for us and submit it to us for review.
What does that mean?
Well, they could, whatever it is that Jennifer's referring to, Sean could put that together in an engineering report, so to speak, kind of like a stormwater report, analyzing what is to come and how it'll handle all the development in the waterfront redevelopment area.
And when? Not just what is to come, when? Because we need to know the when.
But again, we're mixing apples and oranges here. This is a master developer obligation. The applicant before the board this evening is AP Triangle. It is not the master developer.
I know that.
All of those obligations are with
You're asking us to approve something that may very well help to increase the flooding in the area, because there may not be a new system installed that's supposed to be installed by a master developer. You're asking us to ignore that.
Right, but the board is also ignoring the fact that the city holds all of the records and all of the agreements and entered into the city that is part of this application and that has representatives. No, absolutely, it is not the city's fault. What we're saying is that the city was a party to and an equal representative in the context of negotiating all of the stormwater controls that are to be put into place.
Okay.
And so the information can not only be found from the master developer, but also from the city itself. It exists. It's real. It's not something that we're saying will be done with no intention of it being done. We are bound contractually pursuant to all of these existing agreements in place that clearly define the parameters in terms of future stormwater controls. You know, public infrastructure and the infrastructure component report, it's one of the critical pieces of information. The waterfront redevelopment area could never have been or be rebuilt without that public infrastructure piece. And the master developer recognized that that needed to and was absolutely necessary in conjunction with the city to be done, which is why those agreements and those plans are in place. It's to be done over time in accordance with the steady flow and progression of development, and will be done. It's a legal binding contract with the city. All we're simply saying is that, you know, there's no consideration here because it's something being done with the city to the fact that this is ongoing. We are only looking at the specific individual site. You're not looking at the global picture, which is why it's so important to take that into consideration, because all of the comments stem back to flooding, stem back to Wesley Lake. Even if you're saying, yes, we want you to look at your individual problem, it's leading to one global issue, and that is what is being addressed. And, you know, back to Sean Delaney's testimony, the whole point here is that when he spoke to the specifics in terms of you know, what can be done on individual sites, when we looked at the entire waterfront redevelopment area as a whole, they took into consideration lots closer to Wesley Lake, lots further away, what needed to be done with the piping, the systems in the streets, everything curb out. So there is an orderly plan put into place as well. So again, all of those factors, I think, are just, you know, they're being discarded because we're looking only at the site, but it's critical because we're in a redevelopment area and because that redevelopment area has certain parameters and existing agreements that they must be part of that equation.
But I think that you could make the same like argument. So about like parking. So the city has a parking problem. So the individual site doesn't have any obligation to address parking. That's not the way that it works necessarily. And I'm happy, Ms. Porter, to take this issue to city council and
absolutely, and we encourage that.
And I will totally do that, but I will also tell you that I can't improve an individual site plan that is not mitigating some amount of the stormwater capacity that's contributing to a system when we don't have a mechanism where overall that is being mitigated. And so until there's some evidence, and Jason is asking, maybe they could do an overall evidence that the overall system or something the master developer is doing will mitigate this capacity. I think it's really, really hard to approve the system, the application.
I guess we're asking, what about this plan is not compliant? You know, what specifically is the board or you know, Mr. Victor, what specifically are we looking at here that is not compliant? You know, DEP reviewed this application in accordance with the CAFRA permit.
So I guess
what specific aspect of the plan is not compliant that we need to comply with?
I would also caution the board against considering a CAFRA permit by DEP to meet the ultimate capacity standards. It's a minimum regulatory requirement. And maybe Jason can speak to this, but I still think that the municipality has some oversight on stormwater. We don't have to take the DEP permit as the final word. Am I wrong, Jason?
That's probably a better question for Jack, but my understanding is the city has the ability to analyze its own issues outside of the DEP's jurisdiction. So yes. Jack?
I've always lived by, if DEP has jurisdiction over things, I live by their decisions. But you're telling me that there's more to that letter than just as what's printed on the paper. That you've spoken to them and that you can in fact go further. I think Jennifer's question is a fair question. Jennifer, restate your question again for we need to know. We got to, these
so
are.
We need to understand for the record that if the obligation that we're speaking to in terms of capacity and in terms of water quantity is something that is related to the overall compliance of this project in connection with our site plan approval, or if it's just something that the board is looking to do, whether it's a legal obligation, because that is something that's critical. And, you know, to our point, it's already being undertaken by master developer. I'm not going to reiterate that point again. I don't want to, you know, bore the board to death. But the point to be made is that, is there a legal obligation to impose this condition on the applicant when it is, we have a DEP compliance letter, and when it is already otherwise being undertaken in connection with legally existing agreements by the master developer?
In my conversation with Chris Jones at the DEP, when I was trying to understand the issue, I talked about quantity, and his words to me were, listen, if the city identifies a problem, you have every right to impose your own review rules, whatever. I forget the exact wording. Basically what he was saying was, our compliance letter does not govern stormwater. You have the ability, you, the city, have the ability to impose your own restrictions. That's not necessarily the goal here. The goal here is that there's a flooding issue. We've identified, we've heard from the public, we've heard from the board, the people that live there, they talk about some significant flooding issues. And I think with a new development here, we have the ability to help prevent the increase of those flooding problems. It's a pretty straightforward thing. You know, it's nothing crazy. It's done on most projects. We're in the waterfront redevelopment area here. It's a unique animal. Sometimes things aren't required, but in the grand scheme of the development world, a little bit of detention is a pretty straightforward thing. We have just to simplify all this discussion that's been going on, just to see if I can boil it down for everybody. There's two issues at play. Number one is what is the capacity of the pipes in the city to convey stormwater? The other one is, what is the capacity of the lake to hold the water before it discharges it out to the ocean? And I think from what we've heard in past applications and what we've seen in the city, both are an issue. So, you know, if each site was to hold back its water, it would help both issues. If there's infrastructure improvement plans in the works, that could solve at least the conveyance problem. I haven't heard anything about increasing volume of the lake, but maybe slowing down the water from getting there will solve that problem. But that's really what it is. It's conveyance, and it's the volume available in the lake.
Jack, Jim Henry, just a quick question. With the subsequent developer, do not they step into the shoes of the developer for a site unless they have some sort of an agreement with the master developer? The subsequent developer is considered basically the developer of the site.
Whoever develops the site has the ultimate responsibility over the site and the engineering issues related to the site, variance planning, all the aspects of the project are on the developer of the site.
Right, and the subsequent developer agreement is an agreement not just with the subsequent developer in the city, it's an agreement between the subsequent developer, the master developer, and the city. So the master developer always stays in connection with that.
Right.
Well,
which again relates to the infrastructure improvements.
But doesn't it put a greater onus, this is Eric Gallipo, doesn't it put a greater onus on other developments in the future to reduce their stormwater while preferencing the first development?
No, because systematically while these blocks and lots are being developed, there are also overriding considerations which are being done to address it, flooding and these other issues within the entire waterfront redevelopment area to address the problems, the piping itself, the lake itself.
Where do we go to get the answers to these questions?
Well, I guess the whole point that we're making here is we want to understand legally what the board is requiring us to do in connection with stormwater, in connection with this project. So there's been a lot of discussion in terms of what you would like to see or what could be asked in the context of the board.
Board engineer is recommending that we restrain the quantitative discharge.
Yeah, there'd be some measure of detention on site.
That's what he's recommending.
Right.
So Sean and I, when we had our discussion earlier today, we didn't necessarily quantify, but we did discuss mitigating in some form. I would suggest, the applicant come up with some sort of plan and let's see what we could do. I can tell you this, the standard of care in engineering for a situation like this is to compare the runoff from the developed site versus what's there today and make sure that the developed site does not discharge more stormwater than is happening today. Or in engineering speak, post-development is 100% of pre-development, right? So that's the standard of care. I think that would be ideal. Does it need to be achieved? Not necessarily. I don't want to make a suggestion on how to handle this. I think you guys can do a better job of that. You guys know the ins and outs of this property and the development way better than any of us. I'd be happy to have a discussion with Sean, bounce ideas around, but I think you guys are going to come up with the best solution. But I think that's what it comes down to, is some form of attenuation to slow down the release of stormwater.
Jason, Jim Henry again. I'd just like to make one observation. On the July 1st letter, if you look at the last paragraph, it says, based upon our review of the information submitted, and then it lists the information submitted. And there's nothing about drainage calculations or runoff. And so I don't think DEP has addressed that issue, at least not according to this letter.
DEP was submitted the same report and the same plans. Everything that was submitted to DEP is the same documentation that was provided to this board.
Well, it says here, 14 sheets prepared by Bowman Consulting, dated February 12th. Preliminary final site plan for tax map sheet 32, AP Triangle Homes. It doesn't say anything about a stormwater management plan or anything else about drainage on this site. From this letter and this paragraph, I would suspect DEP never looked at that.
But how could DEP ascertain whether or not the project was compliant without reliance upon information contained within the stormwater management report?
I have in front of me a letter, and I read the letter, and it tells me what they reviewed, and it doesn't say anything about drainage. Read the letter. I mean, if I'm missing it, yeah, I can wash my glasses. But
Mr. Delaney, did you submit the stormwater report to DEP in connection with their issuance of the letter and CAFA review?
I did, and I believe Mr. Fitcher mentioned during his discussion with Chris Jones that they looked at the drainage, and because of the close proximity, they felt it was that met the regulations.
Mr. Delaney, I don't dispute what you're saying. All I'm saying is I read this letter. That's what I have in front of me. I don't have anything else. And
I understand your point. I know we submitted everything that was to the board when submitted to them. They review stormwater as part of the compliance. Okay. It's in the 35 items that's required to show compliance. And they've come back with comments before on drainage, so I assume that they would review everything.
I think, Jason, if I may, it's almost 10 minutes to 10, and I think we got to cut to the chase. We got to resolve the issues. We're going around and around. If I may, I think Jason, we got the recommendation of the board engineer, the reasoning for it. He suggested that you come up with something. Now, if you come up with something, or you have a relationship with the master developer. We don't. Maybe the master developer can tell you when and what is going to take place in the near future over there, or you can give us what Jason's requesting Sean to do, give us some calculations or some form of retention of some sort, and break the stalemate.
Is this an issue that could be resolved by compliance with and working with in consultation with the board engineer, such that we would agree that our site engineer would work in conjunction with the board engineer to achieve a solution?
Yes.
Which could include providing adequate information as to what master developer is recommending, that to the satisfaction of the board engineer will adequately address what the issues are, or could include some other relief.
So that's tricky to put on me. I can answer that pretty straightforward. If that's a condition that's to be worked out between me as the board engineer and the applicant's engineer, Sean, I would say that we would have to see that the post-development runoff rates from this site do not exceed the existing runoff rates from the site. If you, the applicant, if your solution is different than that, where post-development would exceed pre-development, but there's some other mitigating factor, I don't think I can make a decision on that on my own. I think the board should discuss that. Anything outside that post-development being less than pre, I think the board should be in on that discussion. And I don't know that you can answer that question right now. You might need to, kind of churn that around a little bit. So, I don't know how you want to handle that now. I guess we could throw it out there and say, if we can do that, yeah, it could be worked out between us. But if you can't, I think you got to bring it back to the board for discussion.
Can whatever you're going to discuss with Sean take place within the next 2 weeks?
I'm around.
As am I.
Why don't we regroup, come back in 2 weeks with something that the board and everybody can listen to, that you two have spoken about in engineer speak, that will give the solution to the problem, if possible?
I'm good with that.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board?
Is the board amenable to that?
Jim Henry, I am.
I saw
Yeah.
Jennifer shaking her head up and down, so I.
I'm agreeable as well.
Okay.
Okay. So then that means we'll carry this. Is it the 27th, the next meeting?
Yes, July 27th.
Okay. So is that okay with you, Jennifer?
Yes, that works for all of our
I see
consultants.
Yvonne.
Everyone is available on that date.
Okay.
Yvonne, were you trying to get our attention?
No,
Oh, okay.
I was just unmuting.
Oh, okay. So can I get a motion to carry to the 27th without further notice?
Yes, without further notice.
So moved. Alexis Taylor, moved.
Second, Yvonne Clayton.
So I have a motion to carry the meeting to July 27th without further notice.
Yeah, I think,
We all got that done. So now we do a vote, Irene?
yeah, it was a vote.
Yes,
Yeah, you had a yeah.
I have a motion by Alexis Taylor and a second by Yvonne Clayton. Mayor John Moore,
Yes.
Councilwoman Yvonne Clayton,
Yes.
Michael Manzella,
Yes.
Jim Henry,
Yes.
Jennifer Souter,
Yes.
Alexis Taylor,
Yes.
Eric Gallopo,
Yes.
and Rick Lambert.
Yes.
Thank you. Application carried to July 27th without further notice.
Okay, thank you. Since we're near the end of our meeting, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Jim Henry, yes. Move to adjourn.
Get a second? Sorry, Rick, was that you?
I don't hear.
Alexis, second.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Alexis Taylor, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? And meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. See you in 2
Good night,
weeks.
everyone.
Thank you.